From a very long time ago, scientists always want to figure out the human brain. Getting to know the other parts of the body is much easier than getting to know the brain, and to this day, we still don't know what's going on in the human brain. From a very long time ago, when scientists and doctors were confronted with someone with a mental illness, they always wanted to figure out a way to help them out or cure it. They thought the issue was physically inside the brain, and they wanted to enter the brain and remove it. But they just didn't know how complicated the brain is. And if you compare it to like a human heart, it's much simpler than a brain. Century after century, doctors try to fix the mind, but they're not successful. But when we get to the middle of the 20th century, scientists figure out a way to maybe get rid of insane asylums with a surgery called lobotomy. The lobotomy surgery we're talking about right now was a surgery that was highly respected while it was being done. But unfortunately, a lot of people sacrificed their whole life and their mind because of a surgery that was pretty much a type of torture. It's in the beginning of the 20th century, and mental hospitals all over Europe don't really have much room. That's because there were so many people with mental illness, and the doctors couldn't help them out. From the beginning of 19th century around the Industrial Revolution, to help people with mental illnesses, they created mental hospitals all over Europe, and they were mainly made to help them out. And back then, they named these hospitals insane asylum. In these mental hospitals, instead of helping the patient out and actually figuring out the problem, they basically use the patients as a test bed. And scientists nowadays compared the humans that were tested on to lab rats. It seems like the doctors didn't care. They're doing all of this to a human being. Like for example, one of the tests they did was to give a patient malaria to see if it fixed their mental illness. But in most scenarios, the patient would die or be permanently damaged. Another thing they would do, they would take a schizophrenic and inject different drugs into them. Most of these patients would either overdose and die or go into a coma. All these experiments continue until we get to the year 1935 in Portugal. There was an asylum in Portugal that had a doctor by the name of Egas Moniz. This man was very innovative, and he figured out a new way to quote-unquote help mental patients. He suggested to help these people out, we have to basically damage their brain to help them out. And nobody was asking him, how did you figure this out? The human brain is formed with two types of matter, gray matter and white matter. Most of the gray matter is made up of neurons, and the white matter basically causes all the neurons to have connection. So let's see what Antonio Moniz figured out. It seems like this guy was a genius in this idea. He said, if you remove a piece of the white matter in the brain, it will fix mental illness. He says when you removed white matter from the brain, you lower the connectivity, and in return, it helps the mental patient be fixed. I don't know what type of cure he was talking about. The first patients of lobotomy were worked on like this. They made a hole in their skull right here, and then they got to the brain. In the beginning, he wouldn't use a knife to cut the brain, but he would use acid. And after a few surgeries, he realized that the alcohol is removing too much white matter. Dr. Moniz was an innovative person, like we said, so he created a new tool, a tool called the Lobotomy. This is a medieval type tool, and it's like a needle. When you pull on it, the strings retract. After that, they would make a hole in the brain, and with the leucotome, they would remove some white matter. Then we have another doctor by the name of Pedro Manuel del Almeida Lima that was impressed with Dr. Moniz's work, so he chooses 20 patients from Asylum and wants to do the surgery on them. 7 depressed people, 7 schizophrenic people, and 6 people that only suffered from anxiety, and tells them, "I will cure you." Nobody really knows what actually happened to the 20 people because they didn't really expose it. But Dr. Lima reported that the 7 depressed people were cured, the 7 schizophrenics saw improvements, and the 6 people that suffer from anxiety didn't see any change. It seems like this was all a big lie to make this surgery seem like it's a good thing. And the people that were chosen for the surgery didn't really have family members worrying for them. In the 1930s, all over the papers were written that lobotomy is a successful, effective surgery. On behalf of Dr. Moniz, they wrote that lobotomy is an easy surgery, it's extremely safe, and it could cure mental illness. This news goes all over the world, especially Europe and the United States, and a lot of people truly believe that there is a cure for mental illness with this. All these news all over the world caused Dr. Moniz to get the Nobel Prize in 1949 for a surgery that was torture. That's why they say the most controversial Nobel Peace Prize in the world was given to Dr. Moniz. On the other hand, a lot of doctors were very critical about this surgery, and they would say there is no way with this method you could cure mental illness. And they would say most of the patients that had the surgery done wouldn't even wake up after. But on the other hand, you could say the doctors that performed the lobotomy surgery had a louder voice, and their excuse was after the surgery the patients don't feel very good, but if you give it some time, they'll start to feel better and recover. Since 1936, a lot of doctors have been talking about lobotomy, how it's a terrible method. Even though a lot of doctors all around the world talked about this surgery, how it's bad, but 13 years later, this surgeon won the Nobel Prize. There were 2 surgeons in the United States that were very interested in lobotomy from the beginning. Their names is Walter Freeman and James W. Watts, and they began performing this surgery in the United States. These 2 didn't agree with Dr. Moniz's method, and they said he doesn't remove enough white matter from the brain. They have to remove more for it to be more effective. These guys start to destroy people's brain in the US. And unfortunately, a lot of people were fooled into getting this surgery done for their family member. On the other side of Europe, in Italy, there was another doctor by the name of Fiamberti, and he realized he could perform lobotomy in Italy, but better. In 1937, he performed the first one, and he took a syringe, passed it through the eye socket around the eyeball, and just like the beginning of Dr. Moniz, he injected acid onto the white part of the brain. He believed his method was better because he didn't have to make a hole in the skull. In your opinion, which tool is meant for brain surgery? The left one, because the right one is an ice pick, and it was used a very long time ago. Between all the surgeons that did lobotomy all around the world, Walter Freeman would actually practice. Before performing the surgery on a human, he would take ice pick and perform the surgery on watermelons. He would literally take a hammer and act like it's a human brain. And he did this to be prepared to work on a human brain. But in the actual surgery, he didn't use an ice pick. He actually used the proper tool. He would not use a proper room for surgery. He would shock the patient to make them go to sleep, and he would insert the tool above their eyeball to the brain. This doctor was also innovative because on the stick he was using, he had measurements in centimeters to see how far he's going inside. It's interesting because he wouldn't be finished from one eyeball. Whenever he finished one side of the brain, he would have to insert from the other eyeball to finish the other side. Like we said, there were 2 doctors in the US that performed this surgery. Freeman was the one with the ice pick method, and James W. Watts was doing the old school method, and he wanted to see how Freeman does it. So he asked Freeman to actually show him how the surgery's done. When Dr. Watts saw how Freeman does it, he was disgusted. You could say after witnessing how he does the surgery, he regret ever doing lobotomy, and he stopped doing that type of surgery. Dr. Watts was so disgusted that he told Jordan Freeman that you took a very complicated surgery and turned it into a 10-minute office job. First of all, this place is not sterilized, and you don't properly put him to sleep. Then we get to the end of the 1940s. Until then, lobotomy is being done all over the world, and we are at above 20,000 surgeries. This is the lobotomy map at that time, and the places in gray were not interested in this surgery. Dr. Freeman continues his method of surgery and damages patients left and right. He would not do the same method on each patient. He would always try something new with someone's head. Freeman believed that with different types of surgery, he would eventually cure mental illness. 1940s finally ends, and at the end of this decade, the Nobel Prize was given to Dr. Moniz. This surgery continues to the 1950s. There were no real power to actually stop these doctors from performing this surgery. If somebody talked about it, it was squashed before it reached anything. This continues all the way to the 1960s, then we get to 1970. It's interesting to know that the first country that banned lobotomy was the Soviet Union. At that time, a Russian doctor by the name of Nikolai Ozersky complained that said this violates the principles of humanity. And after hearing that, Soviet Russia officially banned this surgery. And eventually, in 1967, the US banned the surgery. After the US banned it in 1967, Europe followed along. And finally, this torturous surgery didn't make it to the 1980s. Anyone that was worked on with this method didn't see anything in return. 15% of them would die in surgery. More than 50% of the patients went into the vegetable state. The remaining patients that did the surgery for like depression were basically damaged in the brain permanently. If this was the 1300s, it was kind of acceptable for him to try stuff like this. But this was in the 20th century all the way to the 1970s, and to this day there are patients that this surgery was done to, and they're living as a vegetable for years on end. There is also a conspiracy theory about this, that the elites didn't want to make a noise about the surgery, and they wanted to get to know the brain a little bit better. It's good to note that there is a movie that has lobotomy in there, and it's called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.